Hey everyone, welcome to Forum Americanum. We are your hosts, Cicero and the mighty Gracchus the Younger, Gracchus Minor. And we are here to talk to you, our fellow citizens, about the important events of the day concerning political philosophy or the political happenings, not just of the U.S., this great republic, but also of the world. And we're just so glad that you guys stopped by to listen to us and probably have a few things to say for you guys, but we have a special topic that's near and dear to our hearts today, and I think Gracchus wanted to talk to you guys about what this specific podcast will be and what the next few will be about.
Yeah, today we are lucky to begin talking about free speech. This is going to be generally part of a longer series we're going to be doing on First Amendment rights. We're going to be looking at free speech, first of all, because it's kind of the seminal cornerstone of democracy. Then we're going to be going into freedom of the press, freedom of religion. We're also going to be doing a little bit of freedom of assembly. This is going to be a long series because this is my opinion on these essential freedoms, natural freedoms, if you will, that they are cornerstones of any sort of representative government. These natural rights we have that were enshrined in the First Amendment are very important for the functioning of a government that's based off of the population, the people, that sort of idea.
Yeah, the goal, that's definitely exactly what we're going to be looking at. We're going to kind of outline for everyone at least our understanding of the rights guaranteed in the First Amendment. But we're also going to maybe have a couple people on to chat with us about their feelings on stuff after we've gone through some of those. And then, depending on how people feel, we might dive further into the Bill of Rights itself. But we could also go and talk about a few other items as well. But we both felt that the first few should be focused on the First Amendment. It's just so important, and it's near and dear to our hearts, and it's a lot of hubbub going on around it, and a lot of people don't understand what goes into the First Amendment, why it is there, and what it is. But yeah, we thought this was important, so here we are.
Yeah, I guess we should really start off this discussion on the freedom of speech within the First Amendment, of understanding what the First Amendment says. If you're not familiar with it, you should be. So, just in case you are, I'll read it out. Congress shall make no laws respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for redress of grievances. Today we're looking at the little clause called abridging the freedom of speech. Congress shall make no laws abridging the freedom of speech. This really doesn't need any sort of interpretation or kind of trying to understand 18th century American English. You don't need that here. You just need to know Congress can't make a law abridging the freedom of speech. That's clear, cut and dry. There's no question here. They can't make the law. Now, since then, they have. I mean, honestly, they've made laws since, and we understand there's limitations on freedom of speech, because there are situations that are so morally objectionable that we can't go, this is just unacceptable in any society, and even the most libertarian of the founding fathers would potentially agree. I understand that's historical kind of revisionism and trying to apply, a historical figure to understand the present situation. But sometimes you got to understand certain things are just morally unacceptable. And I guess if you want to jump in there, Cicero.
Yeah, I mean we're definitely in agreement on that. We don't say that as much as we love freedom of speech and we think it's essential to the functioning and well-being of our republic, it can't and isn't absolute. And that's part of our goal here is to talk about what are the exceptions, and I think we'll probably talk a little bit later too about troubling trends we see in this, or at least troubling for me. But it's interesting because you see a lot in the headlines, especially on the right-wing elements of the political sphere. There's a lot of screaming about there's a concerted effort to curtail freedom of speech, and to be honest, that's fair. There is some of that, and I definitely would agree that there is some of that going on, but it's not like it's a new thing. The very first time we see this pop up, especially in a real concerted effort by the government, is in 1798 under President John Adams. They had the Sedition Act. And so rather, if you want to go read it yourself, we'll have links to, like we always do, we'll have links below to everything that we're talking about. And yeah, the Sedition Act is long and kind of prosaic, so it's not an ideal thing to reread. But they did have a nice handy-dandy summary at the beginning of the text of the Sedition Act. I'll read this here. To write, print, utter, or publish, or cause it to be done, or assist in it, any false, scandalous, and malicious writing against the government of the United States, or either House of Congress, or the President, with intent to defame, or bring either into contempt or disrepute, or to excite against either the hatred of the people of the United States, or to stir up sedition, or to excite unlawful combinations against the government, or to resist it, or to aid or encourage hostile designs of foreign nations. That's it's a really good summary of what the Sedition Act is trying to limit in terms of freedom of speech. And from a realistic perspective, there's not a whole lot in there that just jumps out at you as like, oh well, that seems unreasonable. A lot of that seems fairly reasonable. It shouldn't be allowed for citizens to incite the people against the government. I mean, it's kind of ironic considering they had done just exactly the same thing 20 years earlier, but they were maybe not as aware of their own hypocrisy. But I mean, there's a lot of rational things you say, okay, I get that, but the problem is you look at what it says, and it says malicious writing or scandalous writing. If it's false, that's kind of an exception, right? And we'll talk about the exceptions here in a sec, but what is malicious and what is scandalous, and why should that be illegal? But that's just, I just wanted to point out that from the very earliest days of the Republic, there have been attempts by the government to curtail things because it wasn't comfortable with the freedom exercised by its own citizens. So this is not a new thing for all you right-wingers pointing out. This is a constant thing that we've seen throughout the history of the Republic. And we're not going to go into all of them because that would just would turn into a long, winding episode on the history of free speech in the United States, and it's not necessarily what we're going to do. But I think Gracchus wants to jump in here and talk a bit about some of the exceptions that the courts have applied into legal theory that make it for a fairly high standard of how the government can or should restrict free speech.
Yeah, I'm going to jump into some Supreme Court stuff here in a second. I just wanted to add a little bit to what you're saying about how this is not a new thing. It's like there's been limitations on free speech from the get-go. And actually, once we get done with all this Supreme Court OEA stuff, we'll see that we're actually living in probably the freest speech time in the history of America, or at least in the last 100 years. Like, since 1969, you're probably having the most freedoms to express yourself as a citizen of the United States, at least in the last 100 years. I honestly didn't look past the Hallmark case, freedom of speech. Actually, the first Hallmark case, there's a couple of them. We're not going to go full deep into the Supreme Court stuff too deep because this is not a Supreme Court podcast, as much as some days I like it to be because Supreme Court's fun. I guess the first one I'm going to talk about is Schenck versus the United States, 1919. For those of you who are not familiar with this one, trust me, you are. This is where you get the response from Oliver Holmes, where you have things such as the clear and present danger and the fire in a crowded theater statement. These are these kind of seminal things when we think about free speech. You can't go yell fire in a crowded theater. Well, that changes later on. I mean, we end up getting later things that kind of tweak and mess with our understanding of freedom of speech. I know, Sister, you wanted me to talk about exceptions, but I prepared the Supreme Court section. I feel like these are the exceptions. If that's okay with you, I'm going to keep going.
Go right ahead.
All right. Yeah, sorry. When you prepare stuff, you got to kind of go with what you got. There's a few other cases. So Schenck versus the United States, 1919. This sets the precedent, right? This is the precedent for, 50 years. You have a few other cases in the 50s regarding setting even more precedent that does restrict the freedom of speech, especially regarding totalitarian ideals. This is Dennis versus the United States, 1951. Justice Robert Johnson made a big, long speech about it. Kind of ends up talking about the importance of restricting speech that could lead to totalitarianism. This is a really rough synopsis of his response, but it kind of leads to that. You gotta be careful because it was an anti-communist ruling. And then finally, we have the set piece, the great ruling. You don't always agree with what the Supreme Court decides, but sometimes they do good, and this is one of those times. This is even under the Warren Court. If those of you don't know the Supreme Court history, the Warren Court passed all those, held up all those civil rights laws of the 1960s. They were the ones that, forced the breakdown of segregation in the South. They did a lot of stuff. They were a really reforming progressive court, and they made this decision called Brandenburg versus Ohio, 1969. This is the case where you had Brandenburg, KKK member, and he was represented by the ACLU. Is that correct, Cicero?
Yes.
Okay, I wanted to make sure, double check my facts before I say them. Yeah, represented by the ACLU, and saying they have a right to march and speech. A hate group, the KKK. This is not something that's questionable at the moment. And what came out of that was the Brandenburg, which essentially states that, let me pull it up real quick, that court has a two-pronged test to evaluate speech acts. One, speech can be prohibited if it is directed at inciting or producing imminent lawless action, and two, is likely to incite or produce such lawless action. And this is kind of an important thing. It says you can say whatever you want unless it is intended to produce lawless action and likely to do so. And that's a big change from before, because before it was dealing with intent and a lot of less kind of murky legal ideas, and this is very clear and cut. And this is what we've been dealing with ever since, is this speech that goes, are you going to produce this action, and do you intend to, and is there a likelihood of such actions occurring? And this is the law that we live under right now when it comes to freedom of speech. So you really can go out and say whatever you want as long as it doesn't violate the Brandenburg test. So anyone tells you, oh, no fire in a crowded theater, no, that got thrown out. It's all about this test right here.
Yeah, and I think that's really important to point out, because if you read some of the documentation and some of the history surrounding the Brandenburg case, you see a lot of people that talk about how this is something that's not acceptable to society, and it's not things that we should permit. But, and there's some pretty tough reading if you're a little on the sensitive side. Some of the wording that's used in the documents surrounding the court case are specifically difficult. But Hugo Black, who should be basically one of everyone's favorite justices throughout the history of the U.S., because he was a First Amendment absolutist. He when he wrote the opinion that set out the Brandenburg test, he set the bar so high because he was specifically concerned with the ability of the government to curtail speech that people didn't find acceptable. And I think we're all in his debt for doing just that. And I highly encourage everyone to. We're gonna link to everything for everyone, but I really encourage everyone to go look into the Brandenburg test, especially. And there's a couple other. There are a couple other cases that surround the Brandenburg test that kind of give you an idea of what went into the decision making, but realistically, if you just read all the info around the Brandenburg v. Ohio case, it'll give you a really good idea of why we have what we have surrounding the First Amendment.
Yeah, I think if you can go do a little extra research on it, we're not the Supreme Court law podcast. We just want to give you a foundation, because when you're dealing with politics, you're dealing with law, which comes from justice, morality, and ethics, and the end law is a little too, I don't know, not as interesting as the justice, morality, and ethics, in my opinion. I don't know if I'm speaking for myself on this one, but they just seem a little bit more interesting from a rhetorical standpoint than, what is the legal framework? Well, the legal framework comes from somewhere. And on this, it comes from what we all said earlier, what we've already established regarding the rights of freedom of speech.
Yeah, and there's a few other exceptions that are kind of important when we have to look at the limitations that are there. There's certainly more than just a couple more exceptions, but the ones that we're going to be concerned about are more on the political the side of political philosophy, because I don't think we need to go into why child pornography was ruled illegal even though it was technically a violation of freedom of speech, or why you shouldn't be allowed to lie in marketing campaigns as a company, because that's deception, and it's an abuse of the speech that you're guaranteed. So we're not going to go into all those, because if you just take at face value, they seem pretty straightforward, and they're very hard to define outside of their current definitions, which makes it very easy to put limitations on those, because you know exactly what it is. And that's why they're more easily policed, and there's not a lot of controversy around it. The other two that are a little more difficult are the clear and present danger standard, and that was Gracchus alluded to that earlier with talking about Aller Wendell Holmes, and talking about how if you have that, that's something clear that represents a clear and present danger to the United States. And that's largely been replaced with the Brandenburg test. It's their imminent lawless action test is what it's now called, or just more, like I said, colloquially, the Brandenburg test. But also the Chaplinsky versus New Hampshire case gave us a bit when it came to the fighting words doctrine. And it actually originates from a minority in the United States. A Jehovah's Witness was preaching on a public sidewalk, and the local people didn't like it. Is essentially what happened, which is a lot of times what happens when someone in a minority community is trying to tell the majority what to do or how to believe, and that what happened was when a marshal from the town came to talk to Walter Chaplinsky, who was the Jehovah's Witness in question, Chaplinsky attacked the marshal verbally, and not physically. He verbally assaulted the marshal. Said some rather uncouth and unkind things, but I don't think he was necessarily wrong when he called the policeman a fascist for arresting him for doing literally nothing legal. And one of the things the Supreme Court put in saying from this case, because in New Hampshire at the time they had a code of conduct, which is kind of crazy if you think about it. But it was illegal for anyone to address any offensive, derisive, or annoying word to anyone who is lawfully in street or public place or called by an offensive or derisive name. And the Supreme Court ruled that's not a valid exception. I especially like the use of the phrase "annoying word," because if that were a standard, I would have been thrown in jail long ago, as I'm sure Gracchus would have as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So yeah, those are just some of the exceptions that we wanted to talk about because they're important. You hear a lot of people talk about, hate speech isn't protected by the First Amendment, and that's actually not true. Hate speech is very much protected by the First Amendment. It's protected, but it's only protected to a point. So long as you're not calling for imminent lawless action, then no, it's not protected. Or then yes, it is protected speech. But the moment you cross that into imminent lawless action, it is, of course, not protected, and nor should it be. It would be strange to incite the people to violence. But again, I mean, I've heard a lot of people argue that this is kind of hypocritical of the United States government since it's literally based on a group of men inciting the civilian population to violence against the government. So I don't know. It's an interesting thought.
Yeah, it's kind of the difference between the theory of governing and actual governing. There's a little bit of a gap there, and I think that's something we should have learned in the last 250 years. Is that there's a little bit difference between the ideals you want to achieve and the actual government. And so what you end up having is, let's break the law, or like actual having to break the law, because you've created this complex legal structure that we all have to live within, and that is kind of an interesting dichotomy, I suppose. That the nation founded off lawless action says, well, no, you can't get people to perform lawless action through speech, which is kind of an interesting. Yeah, I can't quite wrap my head around that idea, that conflicting viewpoints of the American ideal, but at the same time, you can very much fall back on other standards. If a law is unjust, you have a moral obligation to violate it. That kind of thing. You still have these kind of other ways of viewing law. Because if a law is legal, law is just, then you can kind of understand where this precedent is established. However, if a law is unjust, then you have a whole different set of moral and ethical obligations as an individual, as a citizen. But that's a different topic. I'm getting way off, way too tangential here. We'll deal with justice another time.
Justice will be served, just at a different date. We'll get to that, we promise.
Yeah.
But
one day. It's a very interesting subject. I'm really curious and interested in it, but not today.
I'm more excited because my colleague here will probably have to read some Frederick Bastiat.
Yeah, I have to. I'm
the one of the famous patron saints of the libertarian movement, which I will find very interesting to see what he has to say. But again,
I was actually just quoting MLK Letters from Birmingham Jail, but
yes, but that concept comes from Bastiat. But we'll get into that at another
Yeah,
time.
we'll get there later.
Anyway, so that's cool. We've gotten to talk about some of the exceptions, and guys, take this with a grain of salt. This is research we do in our own free time, and this is just analysis we've put together. We're not legal scholars. Neither of us are attorneys. We're just here to talk about how we see it. So if there's something we've gotten wrong, or if you disagree with us, please give us something in the comments or quotes, whatever site you're seeing this on. Send us an email, send us a LinkedIn message, or not LinkedIn message, a Facebook message or something to tell us what you disagree with. We are more than happy to try and engage as best we can with anyone who has questions or concerns or comments. Just keep it respectful is the only thing, of course, that we ask. But yeah, it's like we're not saying that we're completely perfect, but we do think that we have a decently solid understanding of a lot of these legal cases that are going into it. But now that we've covered all that, we want to turn this to, okay, we know what exceptions are. We know we have a pretty good understanding of what is protected from government censorship. How are people reacting and thinking in today's time period? In this political age of Trumpism and Antifa and the alt-right and the Tea Party and good God, we're going to get into too many lists here. So it's almost like the LGBTQ thing that keeps extending. It's just like if you move that into the political arena, it seems like there's a new faction popping up every day.
Yeah, if we skipped your political identity, we're sorry. Get over it. I don't know what else to say.
We frankly don't care.
Yeah, political identities. We've been over this. Don't get me started.
So we're not. Well, that's whatever. We did that our last episode. How much we really don't care about your political identity, but we do want to talk about things that are important in terms of how the public is viewing things. And I was digging through a couple polls. The oldest one's about 3 years old now, 2.5, and that's from Pew, the oldest one that I wanted to go with. And Pew's one of our standards. Like we both agree that it's largely respected and reliable. And this poll was very troubling to me because it said that 40% of millennials, which we are in that oh-so-unhappy camp, I suppose, 40% of millennials support censoring censoring free speech if it's offensive about minorities. And I find that incredibly disturbing. 40%. Now, a lot of you guys might be saying, wow, well, Cicero, you need a full 66% of the population to agree with that, and it has to be distributed in such a way that it goes through all the states to get 66% of states to do something about that. But I'm not even talking about amending the Constitution. I'm more talking about local, state, and federal statutes being put into place because the people just don't like that. It's kind of an unfair burden. I don't think the average person has the financial wherewithal, means, or even the know-how to reach out to the appropriate groups who will defend them in court, or even the endurance. I mean, if you think about it, getting nailed for an infraction against some sort of statute requires a lot of effort and a lot of your life to get that overturned and become a court law, because unfortunately, even though the courts may rule on something, it's not always readily observed by the population, or certainly not by the governments that are overseeing various parts of American society. So yeah, I don't know, Gracchus, what your thoughts are, but I find that really disconcerting still, that 40% of our generation is okay with limiting free speech if it's offensive to minorities.
Yeah, I'm kind of torn on that because I try to understand that perspective. That's kind of one of my personal goals, is understand different perspectives. However, I don't agree with it. I don't agree with it fundamentally, which you'll be confused by later as I play devil's advocate. But what you're looking at is, I think, just a failure of understanding and a failure of empathy on the ideas that are being kind of communicated within our generation. I think you've had a conversation with one of our mutual friends regarding hate speech, and there's a misunderstanding of the protections of hate speech, whether you like it or not. Like, there are certain protections that exist, and if you think people need to that certain behaviors are unacceptable, then you want to change them because society has changed, and therefore you have to limit natural rights or something along this line. What try to construct this argument a little better. What I think I kind of see happening here is the variation between violence in action and violence in speech. You probably, I don't know, I'll have to look this up about regarding how, similar research on who views speech as violence, And if speech is violence, then that changes everything. I don't agree with that principle, but if that's the viewpoint that's held by 40% of our generation, that speech is violence, then naturally they would clearly think, offensive speech is unacceptable because it is equivalent to violence in their eyes. And I guess that's how I kind of view it. Fundamentally disagree, but I'm just trying to, just kind of think from a different perspective here,
right?
Regarding it, yeah.
No, absolutely, and you're doing the right thing, because I mean that's what we profess, right? Is that not only are we're not afraid to talk about things that we disagree on, but we also say that we need to do our best to understand why people we disagree with believe what they believe. I think if we do that, we'll find much more compelling and much more interesting conversations being held. And no, you're doing exactly what we want to do. So keep doing it. Just don't let me hold it back. But yeah, and actually that's going to be I think when we have our guest on talk about free speech, violence as speech, or speech as violence, I guess, will be a theme we'll talk about, because that's a really interesting concept. And I do fundamentally disagree with it as well, but it is a very fascinating and kind of a new idea, which we're gonna have to delve into a bit more. But I think with our guest, we'll find something. I'm sure they'll have plenty of their own, but we're not going to say who it is yet. But it's going to be someone fun, I promise. But anyway, this Pew stat or Pew poll, which they put out, was really great, because not only did it break it down by generations, and as you see in the information they give, the silent generation, which is also known as like the greatest generation or whatever, the ones that are basically older than 70, it's extremely small support for limiting free speech, and it's about 12%. And Gen Xers and Boomers are about the same, about a quarter of their population supports it, but it's a huge spike when you get to millennials. And they haven't talked about the next generation because they're a little too young at this point. But they also broke it down by gender. 33% of women support censoring free speech versus 23% of men. And then they also broke it down by rough political party lines. A full 35% of Democrats support censoring free speech versus 18% of Republicans, and about 27% of independents. And then they break it down by whites versus non-whites. Whites who are not Hispanic, which I kind of hate that, but whatever. But whites who are non-Hispanic, about 23% of them favor censoring free speech versus 38% of the minority population. And then the one that actually kind of shocked me the most was they broke it down by a small, very small fraction of different education levels: high school, some college, and a college degree or more. And this is actually something that shocked me. The more educated you were, the less likely you were to support censoring freedom of speech. But again, I find that kind of strange, considering 35% of Democrats, and Democrats usually have more degrees in their ranks than Republicans, but full 35% of them support it. But some really interesting details on that, and please go read into it yourself. But it's really strange. We don't want to talk about identity politics or anything like that right now, but it's just a really interesting finding, they said.
Yeah, that's kind of interesting, especially the education level, considering, like you kind of associate certain education levels with certain political organizations. But, maybe more education means you understand, maybe a liberal education is actually helpful. I'm all about the liberal education. Those classes in college everyone hates, those 30 to 60 credits that are required that are nothing to do with your major. Yeah, those are kind of important. They kind of, help you understand things more outside of your specialization. But that's just me grandstanding. But yeah, it's a very interesting breakdown, and my brain is asking why. I want to know. I'm desperate to know why each group, avoiding the identity politics. But why does each group generally kind of have these ideas? Why why is the 30 whatever percent of whatever think this way? Is it because of experience? Is it because of some other thing within smaller identities? I don't know. I'm just curious at the moment. I'd love to hear some opinions that are like not just myself playing devil's advocate, but someone who legitimately thinks this. I'm curious. I want to know some.
Oh yeah, that would be awesome. We'd love to hear from someone. Any of you guys who listen, we'd love to hear if you do support censoring. Please tell us why. We're not really here to condemn. We won't agree with you probably, but we want to have a conversation regardless. And I mean, this is just my conjecture. I think if I were to make a bet or make a guess, an educated guess, if you look at the percentages, I'd say the majority of for example, the Republicans that support censoring free speech are probably doing it from a more nationalistic or patriotic background, to say that they don't want offensive speech if it's going to tear down the idea of America. That's just a possibility, right? And I'd say for Democrats, and I don't think that's unnecessarily, by the way, an unworthy or ill-advised goal. Like there's something to be said for, believing in the sacrosanctness of the United States, that you don't want to criticize it. It's not correct, but it's I can understand why people feel that way, and I think there's a lot of genuine passion and love for this country in that. Equally, I'd say the Democrats who support censoring, not that they don't have any less love for the country. I know many patriotic Democrats, of course, but if I were to venture a guess, I would say that they want to limit the speech, the freedom of speech, because the hate speech that you see out there can lead to greater or more widespread adoption of prejudice and bigotry, and they want to fight that. And so I can understand why they would want to do that. But I think the real answer to both of those things is having a better argument and not using the government as your baton to smash the heads of those you don't agree with.
Yeah. That actually is pretty, kind of brings up a quote I found. It's really interesting, and you brought up like how to counter like hate speech, fascist speech, totalitarian, authoritarian speech, stuff that kind of espouses things that are counter to the American ideal. And it's going to really, I don't know if it's going to surprise anyone, but I'll read the quote and then I'll, let on who it is afterwards. I don't think the way to deal with neo-fascist groups is to try to shut them up forcefully. You should try to win the argument. And that is actually from Noam Chomsky. I don't know if that's surprising for anyone, because if you're familiar with him.
Surprising to me.
Yeah, if you're familiar with him, he's kind of like progressive philosopher. He's a linguist professor. Like he's like deep in the left. And when you get this quote from Chomsky about free speech, about no, you don't shut them up forcefully, you have to win the argument. And then afterwards he gives examples about Holocaust denial in America versus Europe. One place it's illegal, the other one's not, and kind of how it's treated in both. And so it's kind of an interesting idea of like, how do you counter hate speech? Do you violently shut up? Do you create laws to counter it, or do you win the argument? Because hate speech, and then we're kind of leveling heavily on hate speech this episode, but it's kind of the principal argument against or for curtailing freedom of speech. So if you address the principal, root cause, then you kind of address the counter arguments. Things about hate speech is it stands on no moral or ethical grounds. It's if you look at it from any perspective, it's wrong, and yet it still exists because of humans are not that great. We're still tribal, and we still have all these kind of rough things going on around our behavior and psychology. But if you counter it with just basic, hey, it's wrong to say what you're saying. Obviously, that doesn't always work. That doesn't work. I'm not saying the best counter to hate speech is just saying, no, you're wrong and a bad person. That's not going to fix anything. But what I'm saying is the best way. You're not going to change the person making the argument, but if you change the person listening to understanding, hey, like that hate speech is wrong, you shouldn't adapt it, adopt it or you should accept it as truth. You should understand that it is counter to the society we're attempting to create here. I think that's, Noam Chomsky said it better than I did in fewer words, obviously, but
that's shocking on all accounts, really. Also, I'm shocked daily that he's still alive because the guy's like freaking 200.
I know he said this like 10 years ago, and he was old then.
Yes, he's been old since we were children.
I think he's debated Foucault. Like, that's how old he is. Michel Foucault.
Yeah.
Guys, if you guys aren't familiar, that's a postmodernist from France. So, kind of give you perspective of
Derrida
the 60s
and Foucault.
and 70s. Yeah, I thought it was Michel. Oh, Derrida and Foucault. Sorry.
Yeah.
So
two different people.
That. Yeah, I know.
But yes, okay. So that's shocking that Chomsky did that. But I'll take it. I think it's great, and he's absolutely right, because actually, if you think about it, when you criminalize something, it brings more attention to it when the law is applied against it. For example, there's this old lady in Germany. She's got arrested, I don't know, 2 weeks ago, a week ago or so. And she's like 92. And she's a Holocaust denier, which is clear. It's wrong. Like, I personally have been to 2 different concentration camps, and it's how anyone could possibly think that is beyond me. Especially when the evidence is so clearly in your face. But in Germany, it's illegal to deny the Holocaust. But if it wasn't illegal, no one would give this kooky old lady the time. And by the way, it's the 3rd time she's been arrested for it. No one would even notice. But now they arrested this 92-year-old grandma from her house in southern Germany. And instead of people saying, oh, it's some kooky old lady who listens to her, it's given her a platform and made her into a martyr of sorts. And I think that's a danger. And that's kind of what we're getting at, is that not only is it bad for the society, for the government to police these sort of things, but it's bad if you want to try and push these conversations down, because it just gives them a bigger platform for free. But yeah, I think the another poll that we wanted to talk about that was kind of exciting was Rasmussen said 73% of Americans say freedom of speech is worth dying for. This was only conducted less than a year ago. And I thought that was really interesting because that's an overwhelming majority of Americans would gladly die to protect the current standard as we see it for freedom of speech. And I think it's kind of sad that people are willing to look at it as a situation they would martyr themselves for, but it's also enheartening to see that that's how seriously they take it. They would put their lives on the line, and we're not just talking soldiers; we're talking the average citizen as well. That's I don't know. I just thought that was really neat, and I was really kind of warmed my ice cold heart a little bit.
There's still a little hope out there. A little, not much.
A little. And on that front of like, how do people feel about freedom of speech and censoring? Last week I kind of because we're trying to be apolitical here, where neither of us are really in line with the major political parties. So we try and we're going to be criticizing everyone equally. So I feel like we kind of came down on the GOP for being less cooperative when it comes to politics, which is true. We backed it up with numbers. But on this one, I'm going to bring the hammer down on the Democrats more, because they generally, at least in current polling, say that they are more in favor. The Sacramento Bee reported, should we restrict white nationalist demonstrations? California Democrats say yes, according to the Sacramento Bee. This is in September of last year, 2017. And more than half of the state's registered Democrats, according to the UC Berkeley's poll about it, more than half of California Democrats say that is the case, that they should restrict demonstrations by white nationalists. That's a scary number at that point, right? Like, that's a really, really scary number from my perspective. I can't believe that over half would say that not only should they should have that level of speech and demonstrations restricted. To take it a little further, another 39% said their protest rights should be unrestricted. So we got to be fair. Say there's almost 40% that say that there should be unrestricted protest rights under the First Amendment, but right now it's over half, and I don't know. That scares me. Gracchus, what do you think?
Let me play a little devil's advocate here. Okay. All right. So, well, I agree. You should be able to let them speak. Like fundamentally, like go let them speak. Everyone has an equal right. What I look at here is, I guess, the European standard for freedom of speech. I know we talked about a little old crazy German lady who is violating hate speech law in Europe. If you look at where the hate speech law in Europe come from, most of them were established immediately after World War II. When you still have the fresh memories of fascism, those wounds were still extremely fresh, and they really haven't gone away. We still remember clearly what happened, and this is a fact of generally the world since then is how we treat the world after. There's like pre-World War II, post-World War II world, and technically we should have some other divisions coming up. But that's more world politics. But they view hate speech as potentially dangerous because of how the Nazis used their propaganda on it. They took advantage of freedom of speech to spread their hate, right? That's kind of like what they used. They were really skilled in propaganda, whether you agree with their message or not. Hopefully not. You better not agree with their message. But they were able to spread it to a bunch of people. You're able to take advantage of people's tribal nature and take advantage of the ability to spread it and say it. And so afterwards, you see this kind of pushback against like never again kind of attitude. So and so you just say, oh no, absolutely not. This will never happen again. And like you're saying earlier, Cicero, like as soon as it comes up in the media, then you go, oh, it blows up. Well, now everything blows. Now you have social media. You have the ability for anyone to say anything online. So this idea of, well, if you limit it, you also bring it out. Well, that's kind of not the case, not as strong of a case anymore, because now any kind of crazy idea, if it gets enough support, can be brought out of the darkness when it should just be ignored and avoided. My favorite example of absolutely crazy ideas that should never have seen the light of day, and yet we're still talking about it, is flat earthers. By the way, if you're a flat earther, I'd love to talk to you. They are my weirdest curiosity in the world. I don't believe you exist, but yet we're still talking. I
think they're all trolls.
I'm pretty sure they're like all trolls, all every last one of them. One started as a troll or whatever. You want to hear a funny thing real quick on the flat earthers? Okay.
So I heard in one of the groups I'm in, one of the gentlemen declared on there that it is only religious people believe in flat Earth, and I was kind of stunned because I didn't realize that the church stopped before Galileo, and they had an understanding of the Earth. But he triumphantly declared that atheists cannot believe in flat Earth. To which I went and looked at the official flat Earth Twitter poll or Twitter page, and the guy proudly declared that he was in fact an atheist who believed it. So I don't know, just kind of I thought it was kind of a funny aside, just because it's like, well, people believe crazy things no matter what they actually believe.
Yeah, their religious beliefs have no correlation to crazy ideas. But back, well, we'll discuss that at a different time. But back to the idea of like, just because you restrict or unrestrict an idea doesn't make it weaker or stronger. It's gonna stand on its ability to convince people to come over to that side. If the argument wins over support, then it's not necessarily a good or bad argument. It's just able to win over support, and this is more reflective of the society. This is kind of not an exact quote, but it's close enough. Bad and backwards ideas that emerge are a product of the society. They're not from some outside evil influence. If an idea comes up, it came from within. For the most part, if you're trying to incite hate and vitriol against yourself, it's not some it's not some outside person telling you to do it. They might be able to bring it out of you, but it was always there. And I guess my point is, limiting or non-limiting the hate speech is not going to silence it.
No,
so
it definitely
if you can do something to limit their platform, if you do anything to limit their platform, then they reach fewer people. That's the principal argument for not letting white nationalists have a soapbox to speak from. If you say, hey, you don't get that soapbox, you don't get social media, you don't get that, then they have to go even more underground, and you limit its ability to spread. Because from my minor research into white nationalism, kind of crazy neo-fascist, neo-Nazis that have arisen in the last several years, have come out from underneath the rock, they become particularly adept in hiding their message in kind of a dog whistle way. So you kind of have mainstreaming hateful ideas, and people are able to accept these hateful ideas without understanding their, when you say globalism, it really means something much more malign. I guess should I just go out and say it?
Anti-Semitism is.
Yeah, like globalism is, when you say, oh, these globalist, conspiracies, well, that's just anti-Semitism. That's
some
just like
people.
Some people. I'm not going to say all anti-globalists are anti-Semites, but some, especially if it comes from like a white nationalist speaker who's talking about globalization, he means anti-Semitism. That's what he's referring to. And I guess my principal point here is, after rambling for way too long, my principal point here is, if you minimize the platform, you get less people adding on to a viewpoint that is inherently damaging to society as a whole.
So, I mean, I kind of get that point, but I mean, I guess my retort would be, well, who is the arbiter of what is considered offensive and what is considered wrong, right? Like, who is the ultimate arbiter? Do we really trust a bureaucrat to do that? Do we really trust Google or Twitter to do that? Because I certainly don't.
Yeah, but like in a representative society, they represent the people. Like, if
it's possible, but look at the, like, for example, the Electoral College is specifically set up to ensure the rights of people who live in smaller states. If you put these limitations on, what kind of safeguards do you have for people who live in smaller states who have different cultural values? I mean, if you go to Alabama, I guarantee at least a plurality, maybe not a majority, but at least a plurality of people would say they find homosexuality to be wrong, right? And if you compare that to California, they're clearly at odds. Well, there's a lot more people in California. Does that mean the people in Alabama shouldn't have the right to say that?
Well, then you have to ask, is the question itself, like, the morality and ethics of the question, right? Then you got to both like weigh what is right in the face of a majority.
But do we really want the government deciding that much of morality? Like, there's basic morals that we've accepted that the government will meter out, like you can't murder and you can't steal.
I guess there's no invisible hand guiding us towards a more perfect or more correct thing. Like, all these actions have to be taken by people. It's not like a natural flow of history goes towards right. Like, that's what ends up typically happening, but only through the actions of individuals within a society to make these changes towards a more morally correct and just society. These are the things we're pushing towards.
Okay, but these are, again, things that you find morally correct, but not necessarily that your neighbor will find morally correct. And I think that if you put these laws into place and you try and inhibit these types of speech, you not only make people feel persecuted and oppressed, you drive them towards more rash action. And I don't think that's something we should encourage at all. especially considering how tense things are already. To be frank, as someone who's not a fan of the president, and probably still isn't, even though I have to admit he's done some things right, he got put into place because people felt like these types of restrictions were coming about. I mean, a huge percentage of voters have said that they voted for Donald Trump not because they love him or anything like that, but because political correctness they felt was getting way too out of hand, and they felt that people were trying to restrict freedom of speech. So
yeah, they felt they weren't using reason.
Sure, that's fair. But wait until they actually have something to put reason into, right? Like, do we really want to say that Trump is an acceptable price because people feel they're repressed? I don't know.
I don't know if that's an acceptable price. Well, obviously, we can't really question the price of it because we're living with it. We're going to have to look back and kind of review this time in history and see kind of what happens afterwards. It's kind of hard to view a historical lens when you're living in it, I suppose.
Yeah, but even and just to kind of finish this point out, as James Madison said, if all men were angels, the government would not be needed. Well, I'm going to paraphrase that. That's roughly what he said. And if all men were angels, they would be completely rational and considerate and things like that. So you wouldn't need to put restrictions on. And people, even if you did put restrictions on, people could rationalize, say, okay, well, I understand why it's here, but people aren't. And especially in the United States, individual liberty is so deeply ingrained into our national psyche. I don't know. I think that I can understand the point you're making about, trying to limit bad ideas and to prevent horrible ideologies from taking root. But I think ultimately it will do more harm than good. Personally.
And it's I guess it'd be difficult to actually put into place. But another point of view is if you look at the conflict between free speech and the idea of what is censored and what is not, you got to also remember speech and acceptable speech is reflective of the society and culture at large. And so are the censors. The censors are also, people that censor the speech are also members of the culture and society. And that's an important thing to take into account.
Sure, I mean, people are parts of the culture. That's true. But how much so are they? Like, there's definitely... So, I mean, a common trope you hear about criticism against the quote-unquote elites is people say, oh, well, middle America is real America, and the coastal elites are so different. And in some ways that's true, especially if you look at industries. Journalism and the political class, I'd say, are horrendously out of touch with the average American, whether or not they're from middle America or the coast. But do you really think a bureaucrat ultimately this have to come down to a bureaucrat, right? Unless you're going to sign a permanent court to oversee the sort of thing, which I think would have to require a constitutional amendment, giving it the authority to curtail the First Amendment, which is kind of a terrifying Big Brother reality. But anyway, even if you were to assign a bureaucrat to kind of define this sort of thing, how are they appointed? Who oversees them? I mean, look at the was the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau or the Consumer Protection Bureau that Elizabeth Warren championed for. And it was established. I'm pretty sure it's the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and no one knows who actually runs it. The Trump administration tried to put Mick Mulvaney in charge of it, and the Obama appointee appointed his or her successor. I can't remember who was running it, and it's this overseen. No one actually knows who's in charge of it. It's going to court. It might have been solved by now. I haven't checked, but I probably should. But a bureaucratic agency like that would probably have this sort of power. And how do we know how it's run?
Freedom of Information Act.
Well, the Freedom of Information Act tells you who's actually running it and what they're doing.
Yeah, but I guess my little snide comment there is like, how do you know? Well, freedom of information, as long as it's not classified or protected information, you get to know what's going on. Like, you get to put in the request, you get the information back. And I think the current status of that thing is, if I remember correctly, is more that the Trump administration doesn't want to staff it. that's the issue currently with it. They don't want to staff it, and so it's in this giant.
No. What happened was after the last director, I think he retired. I can't remember. Yeah, it's the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. He stepped down. He appointed his own successor. The president appointed the new head, and they both set up offices in the same building, sending memos to staffers saying, "We're the ones in charge. I'm the one in charge. Come see me." And because there was no clear line to say who ran this agency, so it's this unaccountable, unrepresentable. Like literally, we have no control of it as the citizens.
But I'm asking, what administration did this happen under? Was it the current one or previous?
Right. Well, it didn't exist until the previous one. It was
but like this crisis of bureaucracy. What administration did it occur under?
It's under President Trump.
Okay, that's the point I'm saying is you have maybe if you had a more administration that would staff appropriately, maybe you wouldn't run into this issue. I'm not really here. I guess we shouldn't really debate bureaucracy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, we're definitely getting onto the weeds. But I mean, like I said, I get the point of some of these arguments. I just don't see how they're valuable. I mean, just as the Brandenburg test sets a pretty high test for how it should be limited, I have to set a pretty high test of why I should be convinced that the Brandenburg test is in fact wrong. But just before we finish up, there's a couple more articles that I think you guys should go read. And we're trying to pull these, are anything that we're going to do support from, we're going to try and pull it from, as largely respectable sources as we can. Some of them are going to be a little on the right, some of them on the left. You guys are just going to have to deal with that and go do your own research. Like, good God, you can't get everything spoon-fed to you. Yeah. But one from the Cato Institute, which, even though it's super libertarian, usually does good research. I just don't always agree with their analysis. But they said 71% of Americans say political correctness is silenced discussion. It's the silenced discussions that society needs to have. And 58% have political views they're afraid to share. I actually believe that's completely true when people say that, because look at the polls going into the 2016 presidential race. How convinced were pollsters that Hillary could not lose? And I really think that a lot of people didn't give accurate answers because they were afraid of their own political views. They're afraid to admit it. I think that's real. I don't know about you, Gracchus, but I really think that's real.
Oh, that's pretty well established. I think it was first established in one of the Nixon elections, 68 or 72, where Nixon was trailing in the polls and somehow miraculously won because no one wanted to admit over in the poll that they were like voting for Nixon. And it happened again. Like that's, I guess, in the defense, one of the pollsters, Nate Silver, he did give Trump like a 30% chance of winning, and 30% is a pretty good odds. Like
it's still almost 1 in 3, right?
Yeah, it's 1 in. It pretty much gave him 1 in 3 odds of winning. And if you guys want to do the test yourself, you put in some sort of number generator, whatever you want to find. 1 in 3 comes up really often, like 1 in 3 times. But you need to like run the test yourself to kind of understand how frequent that really is. So, yeah, a lot of them saw this like, oh, Hillary's going to win by 73, 85, whatever percent. And you're like, oh, it's gone, it's out, whatever.
Yeah. It's
game over. I don't need to show up. Yeah, both. That was also slighted by that effect. I can't remember. There's a specific name for the effect. I'm sure someone listening would know. And then simultaneously, 20% still comes up often, 30% comes off often. Like the misunderstanding of statistics is kind of a failing you have there.
Oh well, that's not shocking to anyone that people don't understand statistics so well. But I do remember on Election Day, I was kind of shocked, and as someone who didn't support Hillary or Trump, I had planned to go to meet some friends at a bar and watch the election because that was going to be the only palatable way to see the results stream in. And I remember at one point the New York Times said it was 99% Hillary would win at one point in that evening. Now that number quickly dropped as the night progressed, but I was still like, wow, the New York Times is just so sure this is going to happen. They're willing to stake their professional reputation on it, and they got it resoundingly wrong. But yeah, I think that Cato poll is pretty spot on, and it's just indicative of like why people feel why we have President Trump and why people are afraid of the limitations being set out by free speech. And I think that's why we find it so important. The last two I want to, because we're a little over an hour now, so we kind of want to. We're going to try and keep this around an hour so you guys don't get bored with us, which is likely to happen. But the last two was one from the National Review, which is definitely on the conservative end of the spectrum, but still a pretty well-respected publication. And it asked the question, why are female college students against free speech? And I think it kind of plays into the into that Pew Research poll, which talks about how women have a substantially higher, a double-digit lead over men in wanting to censor free speech. And then it kind of ties into the other article, which is from the Washington Post, saying college students support free speech unless it offends them. And I don't know how the breakdown is. Like, are women more likely to be offended than men? I don't know, but it certainly seems possible, especially considering the problems that they've had, or at least the support they have for censoring free speech. But I think it was majorities of students said, when asked which is more important in terms of free speech and inclusion and diversity, 53% said inclusion and diversity was more important than free speech, and 46% said free speech was more important. So 1% couldn't make up their minds, I guess. But when you break down the free speech side, it was 61% of men favored free speech, but only 35% of women did so. I don't know. I don't know why these are the way they are. I'm not a sociologist. Definitely haven't really done a lot of this, but a lot of research into the attitudes of women and men. But I don't know. It's just interesting, and I think you guys should go look into this yourself. But I'll give the last word to Gracchus here before we sign off.
No pressure on me. So I guess I want to make a quick summary that free speech is important to a democracy. The ability of the populace, of the people, to communicate whatever they want is kind of a seminal building block from where you can develop a representative government. If you look back at Athenian democracy, let's go a couple thousand years back. Athenian democracy, every citizen, although it was literally only male landowners, had a voice. You were able to speak in, I can't remember the name of their meeting place. Do you remember, Cicero? I can't remember offhand.
I was never a fan of those Greeks infecting Roman culture.
I have no qualms about that. But this is like you look at like the first democracy in the Western civilization, Western civ. You look at, okay, the foundation is the equal ability to speak, the free speech of all citizens, and that was a valuable asset to developing this kind of collective democracy, representative government idea. And in the current state of world politics, I think to neglect this foundation, this natural right, is to weaken the position of democracy when it faces off against the siren song of authoritarian governments. I know that sounds really kind of a weird statement, but you see, this is kind of my overarching view in general. There's this conflict between democracies and authoritarian government. No matter what you want to call them, republics, totalitarian, I don't care what you call them. There's two distinct government types, ruled by the few or ruled by the many. And America has thrown its hat into the ring for the past 250 years and ruled by the many. And that's an important foundation. And these rights that we're going to be talking about over the next several episodes are just very important to the American dream, to the dream of democracy, and the dream of this great experiment that's going on here. And that's why I defended. I know I defended the other side, but I did a terrible job, I'll admit. But
if only they were all so easy.
I know. I think it's just important to defend it in all situations. And if you run into an idea you disagree with it, well, you have the freedom of speech too. You can address it as well. That it goes both ways. That's the important thing to understand. You don't like what someone's saying, well, guess what? You have the same right to say stuff as they do. That's how it works. Do you have anything else to add there, Cicero?
No, I think that's good. I just want to say again, thanks to everyone for who tuned in. We really appreciate it. I think we had like 60 people for our first week. I was really happy.
What?
There's no way I have 60 friends. So
I don't. I have like 5.
No, so
I have 5 friends.
And I know my mom and dad didn't listen because they don't even they don't know how to technology at all. So I know that's at least 2 that I could have had. They're in my 10 friends list, right? So so we got some randos out there who were listening, and we really appreciate you guys stopping by and listening to what we have to say and droning on about. But it's really fun. This is something we're just doing for fun in our spare time, what little time we have, and we're really excited to keep going forward. I think our next one's going to be talking about freedom of religion, and then we'll do freedom of the press, and then I think afterward. Sorry,
press than religion? I thought that's what the order.
Either or. We'll figure it out.
Yeah, I don't care either way. Sorry.
That's okay.
I have no intent. But I was like, oh, whatever, it doesn't matter.
But we'll do either. We'll figure it out on our own. We'll get our ducks in a row before we record our next one. Hopefully, we do that anyway. But we'll finish out our thoughts on the various major freedoms guaranteed in the First Amendment, and then we're going to have folks come in and chat with us. Going back from freedom, we'll follow the same order. And we'll have people talk with us and tell us what they think, and we'll have an open discussion and hopefully a little exciting debate. But that's all for us here at Forum Americanum. Thanks for tuning in. Please feel free to like, listen, and subscribe. As always, our show notes will be down below or where the appropriate show note placement is. But follow us on Twitter. At Marcus Cicero 63 is my main Twitter handle, and Gracchus, go ahead.
Hold on, this is how often I look at it. Gracchus Minor. I think I'm at Gracchus Minor for mine, and we also have a Facebook page. I know we talk about social media and the ills, but it's the world we live in.
It is the worst.
At Forum Americanum. That's a Facebook page. Pretty simple, cut and dry. So enjoy.
Okay, everyone. Well, thank you again for listening in. We're looking forward to chatting with you guys again in the future. And as always, keep listening, keep thinking, and feel free to let us know if you have any questions, comments, or concerns. Till next time, folks.